Isn't that such a great intro?
I love it.
Hello,
I really
everyone.
do. I think it's fantastic.
I'm Stefan, and I'm with Ben. And I wanted to ask Ben to start the show. So, when are you having Dugan on your show?
What am I having Dugan on my show? I actually, God, like I think about a month before Russia invaded Ukraine, I talked to somebody who had interviewed uh, Dugan, and I actually, and I expressed like, hey, if you could ever set it up, I'd love to like debate that guy on nationalism. Um, and I think I don't know. I suspect he's doing less Western media these days.
Well, people are getting kind of in trouble because they're just having him on still, like random YouTube channels, and people are like, what's going on? But we aren't talking about that today. We are talking about a blog done by a man called Ben Burgess. Where's this blog located?
Yeah, so the blog is called Philosophy for the People. Double meaning for the people in the sense that the parts about political philosophy are tied to a left program, and also for the people in the sense of for anyone who's interested, not just a few academics. So it's benburgess.substack.com. Should be a link to it down below the screen where people are watching us right now, down in the description for the video. And yeah, the last the most recent one, yeah, it's not about Dugan, but it's about an Eastern European.
Well, it's not really much about him, is it?
No.
It just uses a really great paragraph he wrote once.
Yeah, exactly. It sort of uses as the entry point. I think something very insightful that he says in his book, Less Than Nothing, Hegel and the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism. But most of so it kind of starts and ends on that, right? Most of the essay's not about that.
So we're back on compatibilism after we were on compatibilism 2 weeks ago.
Can't stop.
Do you want to kind of define what? I guess to start with determinism, right? Because without determinism, compatibilism doesn't really make much sense. And you define it in the essay as kind of what do you say in the essay? Because I have a slightly different definition that I normally use.
Yeah, sure. So determinism is roughly the claim that everything that happens is determined. In other words, that that everything that happens is a result of chains of cause and effect that are not probabilistic but deterministic, meaning that once the cause happens, the effect can't fail to happen. So one like one way to think about this is sort of like we can also I think that the sort of very intuitive way of thinking about it is maybe like think about like falling dominoes, right? It's not like if the first domino knocks over the second domino, the second might or might not knock over the third one, but it will. And determinism is the claim that the entire physical universe, without some sort of magical carve out for decision making in the human brain, is all falling dominoes. So like I think maybe a sort of fairly precise way of capturing the idea would just be that like sometimes philosophers will talk about like time slices of the universe, by which they just mean like everything that's going on everywhere all at once. And good movie also, but that's everything that's going on everywhere at any given point in time, right? Is a time slice of the universe, and so the determinism is the claim that sort of given everything that's true at one time slice, in principle, if you had some sort of amazing godlike knowledge of all of that, you could extrapolate everything that was going to go on at future time slices.
Yeah, I summarize it as if you've got a deterministic system, if you put in the same inputs, you'll always get the same outputs.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably more concise. That's all.
Just long, too many Reddit posts written to not have a short definition.
Yeah. No, fair
So
enough.
I think it's interesting, I guess, the question whether we should try and define free will first or skip to compatibilism.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's also interesting because you give the example in the article of what happens if you do what we did just now, which is introduce determinism first.
yeah, exactly right. So I think people have like if you start out by introducing determinism, and then you go to here's what compatibilism is. I think a lot of people's intuitive first response is, well, that's just crazy, right? Like, or that doesn't even make sense. I don't know what you're saying. It's you're just playing with words and trying to like redefine free will to eliminate this obvious conflict with determinism. Whereas I think one of the claims I make at the end of the article is if you switch around the order, right? If before you ever mention determinism, if you just say, hey guys, to classroom of interest students, what do you let's talk about free will. What do you think free will means? And whatever. And like you start them rolling on it, and then you give them a compatibilist definition without labeling it as such. Honestly, in my experience at least, most people just kind of nod along, like, "Hey, that sounds about right." Right? That sounds like about what I mean by free will. Like if you say something like, so here's one compatibilist, here's one version of compatibilism, right? If you say something like, well, saying that you're doing something of your own free will means that it arose out of that you're acted out a decision that arose out of a decision-making process that was at least fairly reasons responsive, meaning that so reasons responsiveness is just the capacity to understand and be appropriately moved by reasons for and against different courses of action. So, you think about the kind of capacities that we're talking about. We talk about free will. We're talking about, the ability to sort of deliberate about different possible courses of actions and consider reasons for and against the other, etc. None of which means that you're only free if you're acting perfectly rationally, but that there's some kind of minimal threshold of these capacities that we're kind of pointing to when we talk about people doing things their own free will. And if you do something like that, right, there's a sort of fancy, there's like a kind of paragraph long definition from Eddie Damias that I quoted the article that's like somewhat along the same lines. It's like free will refers to a set of capacities to imagine different courses of action, deliberate, plan, act on the plan, all this stuff. If you give them something like that, in my experience at least, if you have never once said the word determinism so far in the semester, right? If this is just like the first time you talk about free will and you give them that definition, people will nod along. They'll say, yeah, that sounds like about what I'm in. Whereas if you do it the other way around, if you say, here's what determinism is, and then compatibilism is the view that even if determinism is true, we still have free will, people will sort of go, what? No. Right.
Determinism means when you can't do stuff, and freedom is when you do stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Freedom means you can do the things, and determinism means you can't. So what are you talking about? We could have free will even if determinism is true. That doesn't make any sense.
Determinism is kind of often understood as kind of like a magical force which makes you do things, and kind of removes like any causal effectiveness of your thoughts or your desires or whatever.
Right. No, I think that's true. So I think that like one source of incompatibilist intuitions that people have. So again, just to be real super clear about this, when we say compatibilism, what we mean is just the claim that even if we live in a completely deterministic universe, so absolutely everything that ever happens, including all human thoughts, decisions, actions, everything, ultimately arises from deterministic chains of cause and effect. compatibilism is the claim that even if that's true, some of those completely determined actions are also instances of free will. And again, if you put it that way, and I'm even kind of like deliberately leaning into it right now to sort of put it in the way that most provokes the how could that possibly be right intuition. I think a lot of people so I think, yes, you're right. I think one source of like pushback against that is the sort of confusion that people sometimes have that like, they hear determinism, and even if they hear it correctly defined, they still sort of hear it as something more, mystical than that, that like somehow it's like, determinism is, it's like they're hearing something more like fate or something like that.
Like it's pushing them around.
Yeah, that determinism is making you do X instead of doing Y. And rather than just whatever you do being caused in exactly the way that we normally think it does, but that causation itself being part of a much larger set of facts about causation that go beyond you. So yeah, I think that's one source of like intuitive pushback, but another one is just, and I guess this is just like really like kind of skipping to the key claim that I make in the article is just, okay, I think the very framing of the question, if determinism is true, do we still have free will? Invites people to think about, it invites people to think about like the kind of free will that we wouldn't have if determinism is true, right? Just to be simplistic about this, it's like, look, if free will means like freedom from determinism, then definitely you don't have free will if determinism is true, right? I think all the interest in action is that like, okay, but what do we mean by free will in most contexts? What's the kind of free will that's relevant for other important, other concepts that matter to us, like moral responsibility? That's the.
I think what's really important about that Zizek quote that you put is him pointing out, as I took it, that this freedom from determinism is not like this higher freedom, this better freedom that we'd really like to have. Because if you actually think about what that would mean, to be free from determinism, to be free in some way that we aren't under like a compatibilist definition, this means that kind of the desires that come out of ourselves, that kind of constitute us, that's not the sole determinator of what we do. Rather, there's some kind of other internal factor which just emerges out of the ether or whatever. But if you actually think about that, that's kind of just demanding that there's some. That's the kind of idea to reverse things. That's the case where there's some kind of alien monster within you which is pushing you around.
Yeah, I think the thing is, it's not really clear what it would amount to be free in that way, right? We tried
to talk about it a couple of weeks ago, right? About the one decent libertarian.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's like graded on a curve of libertarians. I think Robert Kane gets credit for having like at least the sort of it's like, okay, he's at least like got a sort of detailed view of what he means, and it could say, here's exactly what I mean, here's why I'm being compatible with determinism. Although it's also interestingly unclear whether what he's talking about really satisfies what most libertarians sound like they're asking for, right? Because it's just like, if ultimately the only difference between what he's saying and a version of compatibilism, right? Because you could have you just shift his view very slightly, and it's just a form of compatibilism, right? So it's like the only real difference is that we're postulating like a little quantum indeterminacy in your brain, at certain crucial moments of decision. And it's like, well, okay, but is that all libertarians are talking about? Because like very often it sounds like they want something a lot deeper than that.
But also, like, to me, even that feels like a small imposition. Like that makes you
Yeah,
feel like a little bit less free.
yeah. So I think, yeah, we were talking about this 2 weeks ago. I remember you saying something like that. I mean, I guess like the sort of intuition that's driving you is something like, look, if I'm going to be in control of my actions, uh, my, you know, my actions, my decisions have to be causally determined by certain facts about me, my intentions and, preferences and, and reasoning and all that stuff. And the second you start introducing too much randomness, then, then your intuition is like, now you actually start to get worried that I'm not, like, okay, sure, that cuts away at any strings that are pulling me, but it also cuts away at the strings that I'm using to pull, the world, right? My
Right.
strings that I'm using to pull my actions. Yeah, like and it seems like a lot of so what that Zizek quote captures when he's sort of talking about how um, when people complain about determinism cutting away at their freedom, that it's not me, the agent, who's doing something, because it's this ultimately, okay, sure, I decided to do this because of X, and X happened because of Y, and Y happened because of Z, and ultimately you can trace it back to something that comes before me, so therefore it wasn't me. That he's saying what he calls the unwarranted ontological assumption there is that I am something separate from, like, the world in general, that I'm this,
Well,
like,
it's kind of this interesting question that people ask quite a lot in r/ask philosophy, where they ask, "Why am I me?"
yeah.
And this is a question which is asked so frequently. It has a frequently asked questions special post dedicated to it, but is one which is like nonsense. It's not a question which makes sense, which only kind of forms a coherent sentence because of like a quirk in English grammar. Like if we were in a language which kind of didn't have I and me and just had one word for that, you'd see that the question doesn't make any sense when you're asking why I.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that people do have. I think this is one of the things that floats around the compatibilism debate, but isn't implicated in like the popular debate, but isn't kind of brought out enough. Which is people have some kind of intuition that they aren't necessarily a particular person, but rather they could have been born a different person in a different place in a different time, or that they could have been a worm or whatever. They wonder, why am I me? Because we have some kind of intuition that we are not just a consciousness or something like this, but there's some aspect of us which kind of goes beyond that, which could happen to be in a different body rather than necessarily belonging in a particular one.
I was just remembering, I saw on Twitter a little while back a couple of sort of precocious young philosophy-minded leftists who I follow on Twitter were having this discussion about whether, like, okay, if your girlfriend asks you, if would you still love me if I were a worm, right? Like, is that
No, I wouldn't.
it's like, is the correct answer like, I literally don't know what you mean. Like, in what sense would that
If you're a worm, you're dead. In every significant sense, you're dead.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that there's, yeah, I mean, I think that you sort of have to have like that, the sort of weird assumption that's at play with the, would you still love me if I were a worm stuff, is that there is some sort of like mystical essence of you that's separate from um, sort of any kind of discernible fact about you.
And it's often even stronger than kind of like a Christian view, which has
Yeah.
kind of like a soul and a body necessarily going together. Like at some point during conception, due to ensoulment, there's an idea that it could be like before then, like kind of like you're like a mystical floating thing which existed in the ether that then at some point happened to become associated with a certain body.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true, right? I mean, it's like, I remember thinking about this several years back. I think teaching that Hume essay that we were talking about during the very first one of these, that it's like there's something really odd about the fact that there's like a certain kind of like in practice, fairly secular person who's like thinks that like heaven and hell are silly ideas, but they're like open to reincarnation. And it's like, well, honestly, heaven and hell seem more coherent to me than reincarnation, because like at least if I'm imagining that there's like a person in let's just optimistically say heaven, who in the 100 years from now, who is me, right? You can say that, and I feel like I sort of know what you might mean by that, right? That there's like even though my physical body would have rotted away into nothing, at least there's some kind of continuity of psychological experience between me and that individual with the astral body or whatever in heaven. But I have no idea what the fuck you mean when you say like, oh, I was, William the Conqueror or a worm, right, in a previous lifetime. It's like, well, how is that?
You don't seem much like them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have. Okay, so there's no psychological continuity. There's also no physical continuity. So like, what are we talking about, right? There has to be, there has to be something else. And sure, we have like a sort of set of words that we use to like label that something else. But like, I think if you like really press people on, okay, but like, what do you mean by that, right? Like that, like you could say, I have the same soul or something, but like, okay, but you don't, when you say the same soul, I mean, you're not actually talking about any sort of mental continuity. So like, what does that mean to say that you have the same soul? And I literally don't know. I mean, like, I feel like the more you think about that, the less clear it is.
No, I mean, I do have some degree of this intuition. I just, after on reflection, I realize it doesn't make sense. Like, I have some feeling that kind of I could be seeing out of someone else's eyes, right?
Yeah.
Like that no kind of fact about me would continue over apart from the fact that I happen to live inside their head, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, I can understand like what it means to say that you're like, looking out of somebody else's eyes or whatever in the Freaky Friday sort of scenario where you've but
right, that
like,
is some kind of like soul switch where you keep psychological facts about yourself.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Because the alternative where they kind of swap perspectives but no psychological facts follow over is a boring movie, or at least one without a mystical element, because nothing changes.
Yeah, it's an extremely boring movie because for all we know, that happens 100 times a day, right, and it would change nothing if it did, right? I mean, like if it turned, like, let's say for the sake of argument, like I'm not even 100% sure it's like a conceptually coherent claim, right? But like, let's say for the sake of argument that it is, and even that I was like fully convinced that this was a real thing that sometimes happened. I don't know that I would care, right? It's like that because if you say, well, there's some sort of mysterious metaphysical container for all of your thoughts and feelings and beliefs and all this stuff, but like all of those things are still going to be where they were, and your body, whatever, is going to change, but like the container is going to be switched somehow. And I don't know that I should find that upsetting, even if that turned out to be true. It's like, okay, that's not. I mean, maybe you should switch the container every once in a while. It's like it's like
it out
or something.
We do a lot of blasphemy on the show.
Yeah, fair enough. I did see
that one Christian philosopher did evade kind of the worry about how the fuck souls work, because obviously there's at least one instance of physical resurrection in the Bible, right? And they just say God physically puts your body in heaven. Blah, 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 blah. I
mean, there is like a weird subset of Christian philosophers who try to think if I know of a name. I mean, I know this is a view that's out there of people who sort of embrace, like, I know Van Imwagen says that is just like a materialist about mind, but just says that that's okay. I still believe in immortality. God will just physically resurrect us. Right. And I know there's like I know there is like a position, there is like a deeply strange position that's held by some Christian philosophers that says that this is what's usually derisively referred to by people who think it's ridiculous as the body snatcher view, that they have say, okay, well, what would it take for you to really be continuous with the person who's having this everlasting life? And they conclude that, well, if you're just if you're just like restarting a new physical body from like, materials lying around or whatever, that wouldn't count, which is, you can see where that intuition comes from. It's like that thing I think we talked about during the very first one of these, that if you have, it's like the thing I always find, like if I ask students, like, okay, imagine somebody offered you a free trip to Mars. Here's how it works. You enter into the transport station on Earth. It takes a molecule by molecule, neuron by neuron scan of your body and brain and dissolves the body and brain in the process, sends the information to Mars, where it uses local molecules to build a molecule by molecule, neuron by neuron copy of you that will remember being you and remember stepping into the station on Earth. Who would take that trip? And I don't typically get a lot of hands because people's intuition about that is, well, I'd just be dead, right? That's a new person who, it's nice for them, right? They think, So anyway, there's like different people have different.
Good for my twin brother, but fuck me.
yeah, exactly, right? So like, not everybody feels that way. I will get people be like, yep, that's fine. That'd still be me. I'd take the trip. But like, but if it is, right, then you think, well, okay, now we have a problem, right? Is the like resurrected person really you? So there is this like fringe view among some Christian philosophers that actually God like somehow takes the, as your body's dying, or like with the second you die or something, like switches out the body, so that the
like
that,
you leave the corpse,
that exact body. So like the corpse is like a replica,
right?
that God
He dupes you and kills you, and then sends the other one to heaven.
Yeah, I don't know. So like the thing. So you have continuity of like being in the same body.
Right. That's fun.
It is fun, but yeah. But I think like getting back to the free will thing. I mean, I just think like that exact thing that seems so odd, right? About like really like taking seriously the well, I could be a worm or things like that. Like, okay, in what sense could you be a worm? Right. I think that's like roughly the kind of thing that Zizek is pointing to in this passage in Less Than Nothing. That it's like, well, okay, hold up. If you're, if what you want is a kind of freedom that you couldn't have if determinism was true, that, it can't be that your decisions, could ultimately indirectly be traced back to chains of cause and effect, outside of you. Which again, like really, if it's not the Robert Kane quantum indeterminacy in the brain thing, if that's not good enough, right, then like really seriously, what does that mean, right? I mean, does that mean like we're all like miniature gods, causing things without being caused, like how does that work? And that's and Zizek's point is like, look, I mean, if what you're looking for is like, you're postulating, that you are something separate from the causal processes of the world in ways that gets real mysterious when you start thinking about that, right? And he says,
you have to sacrifice a lot to kind of be a god, right? Like God, for instance, can't change. Like it's kind of a necessary feature of God that he can't change. And I would like to change, so I don't want that kind of freedom.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're not, because if you think about all the things that clearly are embedded and could only be embedded in larger causal chains, your experiences, your drives, whatever, it's like, well, if you're free from all that, right, then it's like, then it seems like this might be a really just a deeply like a longing for just like a deeply incoherent kind of freedom, because like what you're really looking for, in fact, what you're worried is somehow threatened by determinism, is you being the cause of your actions. It's like, no, I want it to really, really come from me and not anything else. But then, like, you start thinking about all the stuff that is just inextricably bound up with everything else. It's like, really, like he says in that quote. I mean, it seems like it's a desire to be free from every part of yourself, right? This is just
Right.
there's just nothing there. That like what would this freedom actually be? If you had it. And I also want to say, somebody in the chat a little while ago said something about animals, and this is a fun thing that I remember Harry Frankfurt has a paper called Free Will, the Concept of Person, where he points out on some of the sort of goofier libertarian theories of what free will would be. Like if you say, I don't even remember, Chris Holm or somebody, some libertarian philosopher he's quoted as saying that, like, every time you're engaged in a free action, there's like a causal miracle occurring in your brain. And he's like, okay, let's say that happens. Notice that one of the things that we intuitively want out of a concept of free will is that it helps us explain why we think that adult humans typically are responsible for their actions in ways that, like, children or non-human animals aren't, right?
Why don't we put cats in jail?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like when you read about, like, weird medieval things where they'd have, like, a trial for a bear or something, and it seems crazy to us, right? They had that's why, right? Because it's like, well, yeah, that's obviously ridiculous. Like even actually not too far from where I am now, right? In Southern California, there was a thing not long ago about there was this panther that had, like, killed a couple of small dogs, and people. Good call, Chip. And ultimately they decided to euthanize it, but it wasn't like, the panther deserves to die. I mean, it was like, well, they thought about trying to introduce it into a habitat. They weren't sure at its age and it's in its health that would work and whatever. And, like, it's like, yeah, that's the right way to approach that, because it's a fucking panther. I mean, it's not, like we don't think that panthers are in control of their actions in a way that would make any sort of notion of moral responsibility make sense. But Frankfurt's point in that paper is, hey, if you're just going to postulate a mysterious causal miracle in the brains of adult humans when they make choices, I don't know. Look, maybe when, like, the panther is, like, deciding to eat the chihuahua or whatever, I mean, like, maybe there's a causal miracle in its brain. I mean, like,
Is it not one of God's creatures?
yeah, exactly.
I feel like we've solved this, Ben. We agree too much. Apart from that, I'm kind of like a real fundamentalist compatibilist, while you're a bit more normal.
Yeah. I'm a bit more open to the idea that, like, you can have, like, a little indeterminism without it being a big, without it being a big problem for free will. But yeah, I think on the, so I'm probably more of a compatibilist about indeterminism than you are, but but I think we're probably about equally compatibilist about determinism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'm just reading all the jokes in the chat about putting cats in jail. Yeah.
I mean, what people have been asking about in chat is kind of how this, or generally the views in free will, then kind of influence like ideas of political and justice and the law and so on. I was also going to mention that you said this stuff about your students, and you mentioned one survey, and I think generally from a compilation of surveys on free will, people have a mix of compatibilist and incompatibilist intuitions, views, whatever, and that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I think, I think that if it's framed in terms of moral responsibility, you tend to elicit the compatibilist intuition more so, although, also, I mean, one of the reasons I even said in the essay I don't want to put too much stock in that is because, like, also just these are complicated questions, and there's a tremendous amount of room to just like get confused about exactly what you're asking and not think about it carefully enough, because it's like I mean, like, I mean, this is why in the previous one about Sam Harris 2 weeks ago, it's like I'm giving him shit about like not not looking enough into the literature on this topic, right? Because I think that because I think it's really easy to get confused about it if you aren't, right, like sort of carefully sorted through all the arguments that people have made back and forth. I just think the studies are interesting because there's this sort of idea that it's like, well, everybody is just naturally an incompatibilist, and it's only like a few like philosophers.
Right. That is the kind of the story that gets put about a lot online.
Yeah. A few devious philosophers with their fancy word games,
who are trying to blame us. They want us to be blamable.
That like they'll be compatibilists, but even they really know deep down that that's nonsense, right? They're just trying to evade the truth. I see a lot of that online. Yeah, I think. Whereas, like, I think actually most people have. Yeah, good question.
I was just going to say that with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is deterministic.
Yeah.
Well, because first off, across all the waves, across all the branches, everything happens. But the thing is, on our branch, everything that was going to happen was going to happen. Like it's one long, straight string. In many worlds where everything happens, there isn't actually any indeterminacy on any particular branch of the wave.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one view of this. I don't really feel like I'm qualified to try to adjudicate between the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the one that says that there is indeterminacy, that some of this is probabilistic, the behavior of subatomic particles, rather than deterministic, between that and like many worlds and the various more eccentric ones. Like I have I don't know, man. I don't. This is like I don't. That's not my department, right? I'm just here.
Let's talk about something we do know about the political and legal system and justice.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So, well, okay, so just to really quickly wrap up the previous point, like I think, I think what's actually more accurate is that most people have a couple of different intuitions about this stuff that could that don't obviously fit together, and it takes a little bit of thought to see how to how they do, right? So and previously, even actually when I was arguing with people about the one I wrote a couple of weeks ago, I'm often sort of prone to say things like, well, look, I don't think anybody, most people really have a view about this one way or the other, because they just have some sort of rudimentary impulses.
Right. It's asking if people are consequentialists or Kantians or whatever. It's like they're not.
Not really either one, right? They have some, like they have some like stories on it that could point to different directions, right? But you have to actually and on some level, that's clearly true, right? I mean, you have to actually do some theorizing, right? It's not like most people, there is something a little ridiculous about attributing to most people who've never thought very much about any of this stuff some like fully fleshed out philosophical position.
Is the average man in the street a semantic internalist or an externalist?
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like, yeah, I think on some level it's clearly true, but I think that I think there's also a level on which I would claim that people are more naturally compatibilist than they sometimes realize, because I think that what I argue in the essay is that that people that the sort of implicit notion of free will that we use most of the time in most circumstances is actually pretty compatibilist. It's just that like there are certain kinds of questions like that that sort of implicitly invite us to think about a concept of free will that would just not be compatible with determinism, right? That that this kind of radical cosmic freedom, that Slavoj was talking about in Less Than Nothing. Okay, so you asked, you started to ask about the political and legal question, and I should say, so there is going to be at least one more part to this.
I should keep this permanently on the bottom.
Sure. There's that I'm not going to do it next week, but in a couple weeks, I think I'm going to complete the trilogy of free will ones, because there's like one other that I actually even kind of teased when I did the Sam Harris one a couple weeks ago.
I was going to demand an essay, and I've forgotten what it was. I'll think about it eventually.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you have to email me your demands later, that's fine.
I'll send them on one of those things they make in movies where they stick different letters from different newspapers together.
Exactly. That's the hostage takers. Yeah. Yeah. So the one I said I'd do in the Harris essay, and I still want to do probably in a couple of weeks, is actually having is one that like is just about this question, right? About the sort of political and legal consequences, because my view about this, as I think we talked about kind of briefly, we were talking about the Sam Harris one, is that there are, even though I think it should be a separate discussion, I mean, because like, look, I think you should figure out what's true, and then you could ask like what the sort of political consequences of that are, if anything. But I am obviously very interested in the what are the political consequences question. That's the sort of thing that I care about. So yeah, the one I want to do to sort of complete the trilogy in a couple of weeks is called Being a Leftist Without Being a Utilitarian or a Skeptic About Free Will. I think that there's this sort of combination of views that a lot of leftists who take, kind of a passing interest in philosophy find themselves drawn towards, which are actually ironically pretty much Sam Harris's exact views, which, might make you, reflect and, come to Jesus a little on this, but
they were cutting edge in the 1870s, Ben.
Yeah. Which are basically, which are skepticism about free will and just kind of pure utilitarianism about morality, that they, nobody's, forget it. Nobody's ever morally responsible for anything. So all we could do, like we're all just kind of walking, talking containers of good and bad consequences. And I understand why people think that this is a combination of philosophical views that's like congenial to a left political program, but I think that's just wrong. I actually think that this is a much more natural fit with Harris style kind of technocratic liberalism, that it is with a sort of emancipatory left politics that
freeing what from what, mate?
yeah, exactly, right. It's like, you want to.
If we aren't metaphysically free, then we're not free.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that I think that actually, to sort of really get the idea that we like deeply care about ending domination, all that stuff. It's like, well, are you really just saying that you think that without structures of domination, people will be 15% happier? And like, that's the only reason you care about it, right? Or do you actually care about that in itself? And I think you care about it in itself. I think you should care about it in itself. And I think that I think that the reasons why, roughly, I agree, HG. You shouldn't care what Harris thinks, just what's true. I agree. I just think that as a rough heuristic, Sam Harris thinks something gives you at least some reason to think that's probably bullshit. But I'm mostly kidding about that. It's not like he everything the man thinks is wrong. That would be impossible. But in any case, like, I think that I think the reasons why people think that there's this left-wing valence to free will skepticism are basically two things that they associate belief in free will with, which are one, harsh retributivist views about criminal justice, and two, victim blaming about economic inequality. And I get how people end up associating these beliefs with with free will, because the people who advocate those beliefs very heavily play up free will, their rhetoric about them. That it's like, look, you're responsible for what happens to you, all this stuff. So like, there's like a very free will heavy case that's made for these things. Leftists quite correctly abhor those things. And so I could see how you could slide from, well, you're constantly talking about free will when you push these ideas, and these ideas are abhorrent, to, maybe the idea of free will is abhorrent. And I think that, I mean, just as a sort of, just as a kind of brief preview, right? For what I'd say in that essay, a couple weeks, whatever that happens. I think, one, there are other, it's like, look, yes, you do need to believe in free will to make sense, for example, of retributivism about criminal punishment. Fair enough, right? I mean, this is why, like, I was just listening to Chapo Trap House is doing a series on the 30 Years War, where in the called This Is Hell, where they were talking about these theological debates among Calvinists in the 1600s, and and they're talking about the sort of like dissonance in these debates. We're sort of like really talking about how crazy it is to say that people deserve, hellfire, when they literally, couldn't help it. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, right? I mean, like, so it's like, yeah, I think you probably do, to sort of, in any kind of remotely coherent way, advocate like harsh retributive views about criminal punishment. You do need free will as one of your premises to get there. Similarly, you need it as one of your premises to get yourself to the idea that everybody's, everybody's responsible for wherever they end up economically. It's your own damn fault that you're poor. You didn't grind harder, right? That's those are both ideas that, one of the premises you need to get to those ideas is belief in free will. But like, that's like, I think my 2 points about this would be, one, there are plenty of other ideas that are much more congenial to left politics that also require belief in free will. As what
I'm going to say that you need a lot more than those two things to then believe in those. You need a lot more than free will to believe in those things, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the main point, right? That it's like, yeah, okay, sure, you need the free will premise to get there, but you also need about 100 other premises to get there.
Like the idea that society is like perfectly meritocratic.
Yeah, it is obviously insane. I mean, it's like, yes, they have like, sure, right? Like, you need to believe in free will to get there, but it's like, you also just need to believe in a bunch of crazy shit empirically that we just know isn't true, and you also need to believe in, like, there's also, so like, yeah, I think a lot of these views that people are thinking of and like intended to, like, a lot of the views that people want to reject free will in order to reject politically are ideas that rely not just on free will, but one, a bunch of crazy ass empirical premises, and two, some just really weird moral principles. Like, if it's like, okay, somebody does something and it's their fault, just accepting that. I mean, you have, as Christopher Hitchens' voice, all your work is still ahead of you, right? If you want to go from there to the idea that it's just like morally good to inflict pain on you, as like that's
and often in the US system for like 30 years.
yeah,
It's almost like an unimaginably long time.
yes, crazily long time. Like I remember this really struck me, like, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. I went to see Angela Davis speak at University of Michigan, and she was talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And at one point she was talking about this family that had like some member of their family had been a victim of like a really brutal crime, and then after the guy got out of prison, they went through this process. They ended up reconciling with him and all this. But the part of it that always stuck with me was she was like, yeah, so he committed this really brutal crime in South Africa, and he was put in prison for 10 years, which in a lot of countries is considered to be a long time to go to prison. And I heard that, I was like, yeah, right. Like, that's crazy that Americans don't think of that as a long time to go to prison. That we're such a like crazily retribution happy society that like you hear that and you're like, oh, just slap on a wrist, huh? Right? Like you only have to spend 10 years of your life in a cage, like it's like, no, that's there's plenty of room for saying,
not the usual sort of thing I like to defend, but I heard some American who I'd heard about for the reasons went to prison for 19 years for child pornography possession. And I was like, that's a lot. And like nobody absolutely no sympathy at all. But I was like, 19 years, that's a very long time.
Yeah, since this is YouTube, let's just go ahead and say, just to nothing can be left implicit. Child porn is bad, but it's also insane. Like 19 years, really? And yeah, so it's like, look, you could believe, like, as a sort of abstract philosophical view, you could even accept some sort of retributivist view about punishment, that like sometimes people just deserve to be punished because of what they did, and still think that the degree of retributive zeal built into the American criminal justice system is like dangerously insane. That's one thing. But then also you could believe in moral responsibility without even accepting a sort of pure retributivist view of criminal justice reforms. This is why in the essay for this week, I mean, I said, like, I kind of took pains over the course of a few paragraphs to be like, look, when I say moral responsibility, I'm not talking about anger. I'm not talking about punishment. I'm not talking about any of that, because those are all further questions, right? Once we've established that somebody is morally responsible for, even committing some really heinous crime, then the next question might be, okay, what do we think should happen, right? But like, there's no just saying they're morally responsible doesn't in itself commit you to anything, to any sort of conclusion one way or the other about that. I mean, you can think that something like in an ordinary, mundane, day-to-day interaction with people way, you can think somebody did something bad and it's their fault and forgive them for it. You can think that something's bad and it's their fault and just not care very much either way, because sometimes you just don't care very much about things. Or sure, you could get angry at them, right? Those are all compatible. You could think that somebody committed a really heinous crime and advocate that they be punished because you think they deserve to be punished, or you could.
I mean, in some substantive way, it's only in the case where they're responsible that you can forgive them, right? Because otherwise, there's nothing to forgive.
Absolutely, right. This is something like my friend Ryan Lake has talked about, that that there's something that, like, it's not even clear that it's like, okay, forget retributivism. Let's just assume that retributivism is wrong, and we have some kind of restorative justice idea of how the criminal justice system should work, right? It's not that, like, instead of thinking that people deserve to suffer because they did something bad, just think, well, people doing something bad is a problem that needs to be solved by, like some sort of process where you figure out how to restore the way things were. I'm not, that's not a good explanation, but whatever. Like they have a just like look up a better explanation of what restorative justice advocates are saying and like fill that in, right? It's like not clear to me that it's sort of that makes sense if you're not taking people seriously as autonomous beings who are responsible for their own actions. That like they have a, because it's like that whole process is very much about sort of like, okay, how can I, how could you and I have this encounter where we're both, where we're both ready to put this behind us and, and move on and all of that. Like that's I think you might actually need to think of everybody involved in that process as, as an autonomous agent who's meaningfully responsible for their own decisions for that to even make sense. And certainly on a, whatever's true about the criminal justice system on a day-to-day level, and like, yeah, like, I mean, the whole notion of forgiveness doesn't, like assumes moral responsibility. And so it's like, yeah, all of these questions of like, should you, is punishment, is retributivism right? Or if it's not right, is some sort of restorative justice conception better than retributivism? Or should people, are the only reasons why anybody should be legally punished pragmatic reasons? All of those are really interesting questions. But the point is that any possible answer to those questions is entirely consistent with belief in moral responsibility.
Yeah, and a lot of views aren't in some significant way. Certainly, a lot of ethical views before you get to the political aren't, like, basically outside of consequentialism, which is why it appeals to Sam Harris. The other normative views don't really make sense if we don't have free will. I think people kind of, as with like a big thing on kind of social philosophy is people like like moral skeptics asking like, what the fuck is normativity anyway? And in their posts they've said the word should like 12 times.
Yeah, why should we believe this, right? Yeah, it's like, well, clearly you believe in some kind of normativity.
I think people don't realize how much they have to give up when they become skeptical of these things. And, I am generally inclined to moral anti-realism, but I try not to have my cake and eat it. I try to kind of grapple with how much you have to actually give up when you try and give up these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the moral, the moral realism and anti-realism question is interesting, but I don't know that I have too much useful to say about it, right? I mean, like I'm very much not inclined towards the sort of heavy duty realism where you think that there's like that morality is about discovering these like metaphysical should facts that are sort of like waiting for you to find them somehow. I mean, that seems very don't grab with it. Yeah, that seems pretty dubious to me for all sorts of reasons, right? But I also think that even if you think that on some level, as I do, right, that it's like however exactly, whatever sort of fancy, well worked out philosophical view you should adopt to sort of make sense of this, if the sort of rough framework that you have for thinking about morality is still, is something that's like very deeply human, that like we have that, look, there are normative goals that we care about, and what we're ultimately doing in moral reasoning is we're sort of try to figure out, well, if I care about this, then does that mean that I should also care about this? Try to hammer that into an internally consistent picture, try to, convince other people to care about the things we care about by appealing to things in the overlap, all that stuff, which is like roughly the picture that I have. I don't think that gets you off the hook of sort of seeing how kind of living, like, it's as far as the free will question we've been talking about, right? In other words, like, I don't think you have to think that moral responsibility is something that flows out of these sort of deep metaphysical facts about morality in order to think that it's incoherent, to think that that we can be morally responsible for things that aren't under our control.
Matt said or asked or whatever, I don't think you need to believe in free will or moral responsibility to support restorative justice about repairing the harm done. But why should, if the case isn't, if free will is false, why should the person who did the crime be the one that has to repair it? If they're as unresponsible as anyone else for doing it. If I've done a murder, why should I have to repair the damage done and not Ben?
Yeah.
I'm responsible for it. But if I'm not responsible for it in any significant sense, if I'm not blamable for it, then there's no reason that I should be the one restoring the damage as opposed to Ben or anyone else.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I think that I know there are people who try to sort of
I mean, it could be like a pragmatic thing that I'm in the dock and he isn't.
Sure.
And he can get me to do it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, look, there could be like pragmatic reasons to sort of, but it's like at that point, it's no different than a sort of punishment framework, right? That it's like in both cases, it could be the case that there are pragmatic reasons to sort of act as if, we thought that this was like the objectively justified way to do things, even though it's not, but like, okay, fine, but like, but that's not I think in both cases, I think if you're going to make sense of the framework as like actually objectively justified, and not just a sort of like pragmatically useful way to act, it's probably going to be difficult to do that without some sort of belief in autonomy and responsibility. I think, right? I think that's right. But like, what I'm sure is right is that like just believing in moral responsibility by itself doesn't tell you whether you should have a restorative justice framework for how you think the criminal justice system should work, or a retributive one, or some third one, or a fourth one, or a fifth one, right? I mean, that's just it's just a further question. Like, we have to ask a bunch of other moral questions after we've done the sort of easy, simple one, which is like, are things sometimes people's fault?
Right. Which, as clearly is agreed with us, but not with chat, is the compatibilist view.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I should say, like, that just that saying that things are sometimes people's fault is like saying that requires some sort of belief in free will is actually relatively uncontroversial in the literature on this, right? In other words, like, look, nothing is 100% uncontroversial. I mean, it's like I think like Cicero has that line, right, about how there's no position so absurd that it hasn't been advocated by some philosopher. Like, you could always find somebody somewhere who denies everything. But like, but by and large, something that both most compatibilists and also most incompatibilists and free will skeptics agree on is that there's a control condition for moral responsibility, that it only makes sense to say that people are responsible if there's some important sense in which they're in control of their actions. And so if there's no important sense in which you're in control of your actions that's compatible with determinism, and determinism is true, or we're worried that it's true, then moral responsibility goes out the window. And that's something that, like, I mean, pretty much almost every thoughtful free will skeptic says that. In fact, like, they typically, some of them think it's like, a tragedy, right? I think like Smolansky says we should like stop talking about this, because we don't, they're going to be, we don't want to rob people of this wonderful illusion.
There's this idea of like government house consequentialism, right? Where you think utilitarianism is true, but you don't tell people about it because
exactly,
actually not act in the common good. And yeah, there can be like a government house incompatibilism where we should. It's obviously true among us clever people, but we should shut the fuck up about it.
Yeah. Don't say it where the peasants can hear you. And so there's that view, and then there's the view that's held by people like Dirk Pereboom, who's probably one of the smartest free will skeptics that I know about. I actually embed one of his lectures in the essay for anybody who's interested in sort of the best case for that view. And like what somebody like Pereboom will do is like after giving this, pretty rigorous argument, I'm obviously not convinced by it, against belief in free will, he'll be like, yeah, so no moral responsibility. How bad is that? And then he's like, actually, it's not so bad, and maybe it's even good, because and then there's
Right.
this sort of,
He does have this book. What's it called? Living with Free Will, and it is good that he does actually grapple with these issues.
yeah, totally, and even like Sam Harris, who's like a little sloppy about how he puts it in his book, but I mean, like his view is essentially the same as Pereboom's view. Is like, because it's like his phrasing muddies the issue a little bit, because when he says responsibility, if you like read him carefully, what he means is like holding people responsible in the sense of like punishing them or whatever. But it's like he's very clear on the fact that he thinks that's only justified in a utilitarian way, because like obviously we wouldn't have objective moral
And
responsibility.
as it's known, literally everything can be justified by utilitarians if you stipulate the right numbers.
Yeah. I mean, what's the G. Cohen example about the eyeball lottery? You have some future scientific dystopia. You've gotten really good at curing blindness by transplanting eyeballs. And so, but there aren't enough volunteers, so the government institutes an eyeball lottery, like the Vietnam War draft lottery. That's
the one eyeball policy.
Well, maybe not a complete one eyeball policy. I guess it depends on how many eyeballs there are to go around.
Right. Well, I mean, China didn't actually stop people from having a second child.
Yeah.
I think, Kush, I was going to say earlier that I think when people have this idea about, being a worm or being born in someone else's body, this is what's going on, that they have like a two-order view of kind of what they are, where there are these kind of facts which are like incidental, like the fact that I support Newcastle United instead of Sunderland is kind of not like something which is quite important for me, but it could be otherwise, and I could be more or less the same sort of person.
Sure.
And there's these kind of first order facts which are like that, and then there's some kind of fundamental features that really make us up, which are constituted in some way which is beyond this, which I don't think is true, but I think is kind of something people might intuitively think.
Yeah, I think you have to think something like that, right? Unconscious is an interesting word choice there, right? Because it's like there's a sort of strange melding of like psychoanalysis speak with the metaphysical framework that is I don't know. Anyway, there's a like it's not. I'll just put a little note on that I'm not 100% sure that's all consistent, but I mean it's also, I mean he's right. I mean, like I think that is more or less what a lot of people believe, right? I mean the whole idea of like past life regression hypnosis, right, is that I mean that seems to be about the idea that somehow buried in your subconscious is your memory of being Charlemagne or the worm or whatever. And
right, and it's kind of almost like an astrology thing where they describe these very kind of general facts, and you're like, damn, that's me.
Yeah.
Like I've always been a Virgo in all of my past lives.
Yeah.
Like vague, but also specific, but also general, but also like not overwhelming, but also describing to some degree,
Right. That's yeah. No, I've always been a bit of a control freak, and then I found out that that I was Stalin in a past life, and now it all makes sense.
So Ben, what's on the docket for next week? I mean, I did ask this last week, and
I lied. Yes. Yeah. I told you a lie.
About lying. What counts as a lie? You didn't intend to deceive me, so.
No, I didn't lie. I did say a falsehood, but at the time I said it, I believed it. Yeah, so the Plato one that I teased last week is coming, but it's not next week. The next week, I am I'm actually dipping into the stuff I did for my Hitchens book and talking about his debate with William Lane Craig and the Kalam cosmological argument.
Oh, right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what my demand was going to be, but I do want some moralism essays.
Okay. Well, we'll think a little bit more and formulate your list of demands and cut the letters out of the newspapers and we'll send them to me with the hostage's ear and we'll talk.
Kalam, is Kalam cosmological, not ontological, right?
Yeah. Ontological argument is the most fun one because it's one that I think like all of the other arguments for the existence of God, I could actually imagine how somebody could be persuaded by one of them, right? That's like, okay, I could, hear my objections X, Y, and Z to this argument, but I could see how this argument would sound compelling to somebody. Ontological, I really want to meet the person who's convinced of the existence of God by the ontological argument. That's so for people who aren't familiar, the ontological argument is the one where it's like the God is by definition that which is greater than any other that we could possibly imagine. And if God didn't exist, then we would be able to imagine something greater, which would be a being exactly like that, but with the extra virtue of existence. But it's incoherent to say that there's a being that would be greater than the greatest being, therefore God must exist. Like, I really want to know the person who hears that. It's like, oh shit, there is a God.
I mean, I'm not that much of a hater of the ontological argument. I mean, I do get what you mean. That kind of, it's like, well, how does that kind of get you there if you're not there already? But
well,
I think
what I mean is more that it's like
appealing.
I mean, like, I think there's an interesting question here about if there is something wrong with it, which I do think there is. Like, what's wrong with it, right? I think there's like an interesting argument to be had about sort of trying to figure out exactly what's wrong with the argument and how to respond to it and all that. What I mean is more just like, in my experience, regardless of people's religious beliefs, their visceral response to that argument is, wait, what?
But what about Perfect Island?
Really? Well, I mean, even before they figured that out, right? I mean, it's like, it just sort of sounds like, there's something that the mind kind of rebels against.
If compatibilism is word games, then ontological argument definitely is.
Yeah. That's sort of like the most unsympathetic response that some people have to compatibilism. That like, oh, come on, you're just playing word games. This is, like, I think that's the reaction that, in my experience, at least, even a lot of people who agree with the conclusion have about the ontological argument. But yeah, the cosmological argument is a little bit better than that.
Ben, do you want to hear my ontological argument against God?
Let's do it.
Which proves that God is impossible in all possible worlds.
Let's do it.
And it's obviously kind of a reverse or a parody of Platinga's argument. The argument basically goes as kind of Platinga says, is a reverse of that. Platinga basically argues that if God is possible in one world, then if he's in that world, he's all powerful. So he basically, in some significant sense, he's possible in all worlds. So if he's possible at all, then he exists, basically. My suggestion is that gratuitous evil is possible, which basically people don't know. Gratuitous evil is kind of a bad thing that can't coexist with God. It's that right. Bad, like kind of a child being born and starving to death in some horrible way for no reason.
Yeah, right. Like that nobody learns anything from it. There's no greater good that comes of it, So it's something that. So gratuitous evil just meaning like evil that an all good being wouldn't allow. Yeah.
So if there's gratuitous evil in one possible world, then God can't exist in that world. And if God can't exist in one possible world, then there's some deficiency with him, and so he can't exist in any possible world.
Yeah, that sounds just as good to me.
And I googled this, and someone actually did a PhD on this.
Oh, okay.
I came up with all by myself, but someone's actually, it was just recently. So it was clearly like a millennial thought. But yeah.
Fair enough. Well, I will see you next week.
We can knock off. Goodbye, everyone.